Hello, and welcome to Nothing Ever Happens in Canada, but we know this is simply not true. This is a Canadian podcast about the myths, legends, and just good old stories Canada has to tell. I'm Canadian Girl. Thanks for joining me today on this UFO adventure. But first, I thank you all for your support no matter how you choose to show it, even if you are just telling everyone you know to listen. I see you listening in Brazil, Italy, Singapore, Finland, Bahamas, Iran, Qatar, Ireland, Philippines, Denmark, and Egypt, just to name a few. Hello out there to my Canadian adventurers around the world. Now let's get going to the Yukon, along the Klondike Highway, to discover numerous eyewitness tales about a UFO the size of a football stadium that was seen on the night of December 11th, 1996. Zip those coats up tight, seatbelts on, and keep your eyes on the sky along this dark stretch of highway. It was Wednesday, December 11th, 1996, just outside of Whitehorse, while driving along the Klondike Highway between Fox Lake and Pali Crossing up in the Yukon Territory, where at least 22 eyewitnesses saw a remarkable craft said to be the size of a very large football stadium, traveling about 216 kilometers or 134 miles along the Klondike Highway over a course of about 2 hours. The first witnesses were all around the Carmacks area, which is dead center between Fox Lake and Pali Crossing. Here in Carmacks, 9 witnesses reported seeing the craft. The first set of witnesses, all labeled C1 to C4. All witness names were protected due to the fact that they lived up in small northern communities where one's family may be judged by someone claiming such a thing. In order to get witnesses to come forward in such small communities, in a situation like this, lead investigator Martin Jessic, who was known for studying UFOs in the North, promised absolute secrecy when it came to their identities, labeling all witnesses from Carmacks with the letter C and a corresponding number, example C1 for the first witness in Carmacks, and F1 for the first witness in Fox Lake. To protect the identities of those that experienced this event, I will honor Investigator Jessic's labels for each witness. Witnesses C1, C2, C3, and C4 were all driving down the Klondike Highway together in a truck heading north towards Carmacks, when C1 spotted a strange group of lights in the northwest sky above the nearby hills around 7 p.m. He claims he saw 3 orange lights in a row, with more smaller white ones on it. He noted the object was very large. He didn't say anything to the rest of the guys in the truck. He wanted to see if they noticed it too, or if he had just lost his mind. Then, after a couple miles more of driving down the road, the other men in C1's truck had spotted the strange lights as well. They all agreed to pull off the highway and take a closer look. They claimed the lights appeared to be on a very, very large object that was moving across the sky very slowly. Witness C2 admitted to believing the strange lights were just some kind of plane at first, but then he realized the lights were orange and he had never seen a plane with orange lights. He also noted it had smaller white lights on the body of the craft. As they stood on the side of the road and observed the unknown object, they all estimated the craft was about 100 feet or 40 meters across and was moving to the east. A couple of the men even said the light seemed to disappear behind another larger, dark object, as opposed to just turning off or disappearing behind a hill, as some claim they did. After about 10 minutes, the light seemed to just simply vanish. C2 from the truck of men also spoke with his brother, who also saw the unknown craft while watching TV with his family. They are labeled witnesses C5 to C9. While the family watched television in front of a large window in Carmacks, they all saw a row of strange lights flying by. They assumed it was a 747, but when it made no noise, it really got their attention, as it flew towards the northeast sky. Even their 6-year-old child noticed the craft, as it was so large and flying so slowly across the window behind the television. He asked if it was Santa. Strange, isn't it? Square orange lights, and white smaller ones. A very large dark object, moving so slowly, and no noise at all. What do you think it is? Let's head down to Fox Lake and see what those witnesses have to say. It might just help us figure out more about what's really going on here. From Carmacks to Fox Lake, it is about a 1-hour drive. The lake is about 17 kilometers or 11 miles long and runs along right beside the stretch of highway. You'll also find just 34 kilometers or 21 miles north of Fox Lake, the Braeburn Lodge. Not only are they famous for their gigantic cinnamon buns, they also played a small role in this very strange night, but we'll get to that part in a bit. Our first Fox Lake witness was driving from Whitehorse down the Klondike Highway, near the south end of the lake, when he suddenly saw a bright white light to the northwest over the far end of the lake. He is known as Witness F1. He claims to have watched the light casually along his drive for about 10 miles or 16 kilometers. Once he got to the northern tip of the lake, he noticed 3 rows of rectangular lights just as they slowly disappeared behind the hill. He was so excited, he stepped on the gas to try and catch up to it. He believed he was going about 35 miles or about 60 kilometers an hour. He kept scanning the sky, wanting to see the craft again, when he pulled over into the Braeburn Lodge I told you about earlier to tell owner Steve Watson his story after he continued on his way home to Carmacks. He also stated he saw 2 other vehicles during his drive. They were in fact witnesses F1 and F3. The pair of cousins left F3's home in Whitehorse about 7:30 p.m. driving separately. They were heading back towards Carmacks along Fox Lake Road. F2 was driving in front of F3 about 1.6 kilometers or about a mile. They were both driving right beside the lake, when F2 was the first to notice a very large strange object with rows of lights in the sky at about 8:30 p.m. You can see F2's drawing of the UFO at nothingcanada.com under the show's notes section or in the links below. In disbelief, the first cousin, F2, looked back at the other and signaled to pull off the road. The pair of cousins both pulled over on the side of the road to get a better look. The craft moved straight towards them. They were about to have a very close look indeed. As it passed over F2 and F3's parked vehicles, they could both see the bottom side of the craft. F2 got right out of his vehicle. F3 was parked slightly down the road, but stayed inside his vehicle and watched as it flew right over his cousin. They described it as having a very bright white light that came from the center, and it made no sound at all. The light was so bright it lit up the entire valley, F3 stated. F2 claimed that the UFO had a solid, smooth surface. He also said he never felt afraid, more in awe of the object as it silently moved over him. In the midst of it all, F3 remembered he had one of those old disposable cameras, the ones we all had in the 90s, and had to wait forever for the pictures to be developed. F3 said he might have took about a minute to retrieve the camera from his bag. He pointed the camera at the object, and when he did that, it lit up even brighter and raced away to the southeast before he could even come close to taking a picture of it. He said that moment shocked him. He noted the time as 8:30 p.m. at that moment. It then passed over the mountains and out of sight. F2 then tried to call out on a 2-way radio to see if anyone else in the area had seen what they had just saw, but the radio was nothing but static. So the cousins got back in their cars and continued on and stopped at a local campground to pull off to collect their thoughts again. When a family passing along with a child in the car stopped, witnesses F4 and F5, they were traveling from Whitehorse to Pali Crossing. F4 was driving north down the Klondike Highway when the pair saw 2 long rows of rectangular lights in the distance over the lake that was moving very slowly and was very large. The travelers would all confirm with one another they had all seen a very strange, large glowing object around the same time about 8:30 p.m. F4 and F5 continued on immediately and stopped at the Braeburn Lodge for some coffee and to clear their heads as they told their story to the owner, Steve. F3 would also make a pit stop at the Braeburn Lodge later that evening to share his tale from the strange evening, and possibly grab one of those famously huge cinnamon buns. But to his surprise, he learned from owner Steve Watson others had come into the lodge that night to share their stories as well of the very strange, large object. F3 also made a drawing of the object he himself said he knew was a UFO as soon as he saw it. His drawing can be seen with the others at nothingcanada.com under the show notes section or in the links below. He would also call air traffic control the next day to ask what was flying over Fox Lake the previous evening, when they replied back that there was nothing. So what was it? What was flying around the lake that night? In total, there were 6 witnesses in the Fox Lake area. F6, like F1, was driving alone in the area and did not provide a whole lot of detail. But the couple F2 and F3 and the family F4 and F5 with the young child, because they saw the craft at the same time, roughly from different angles, they were able to provide a lot of information when it came to determining the size of the craft, the timeline, and the location. The group all drew pictures of the strange object that they had seen, and they were all very similar in detail. It was said that the unknown object that crossed the sky that evening was about 1.8 kilometers or just over a mile in length. Compared to the longest sports stadium in Canada, as the object was most often claimed to be bigger than a football stadium by most witnesses that night, the Commonwealth Stadium in Edmonton, Alberta is only 0.25 of a kilometer or 0.15 of a mile, so that means it was believed to be possibly 8 times bigger than the largest stadium in Canada that silently snuck along the Klondike Highway that December night. And the bigger question on everyone's minds? Did they in fact come for the famous Braeburn Lodge cinnamon buns? As many townfolk now joke. We'll have to see what the rest of the witnesses have to say. Let's keep going. Our final stop in this Yukon UFO mystery is up in Pali Crossing, a small village located just over 3 hours north of Whitehorse and only 1 hour from the first sighting in Carmacks. It seems our UFO went on a weird path as it roamed around the sky that December night. It started out in the middle around Carmacks, then headed south towards Fox Lake, where we just came from, and then it continued on past Carmacks again and north to Pali Crossing, where we are now. Our first witness here is the only one not want to remain anonymous. His name is Don Trudeau, a local trapper. He was out working his lines about 6 miles or 9 kilometers northeast of town when he said he had a very close encounter with a large craft around 8:50 p.m. His trap line runs east of the Klondike Highway. He claims he was looking west when he saw it, a huge row of lights moving in the distance. He immediately thought it was an airplane going to crash. It was moving so slow, and that's when he realized it was a UFO. He then claims he got out his flashlight, and the craft came right towards him, almost as if attracted to the light. He then cupped the end of his flashlight to test his theory, and the craft just stopped 300 yards or less than half a kilometer in front of him. He stood frozen, just watching to see what the craft would do next. Don then claims a beam of white light came out from the bottom of the craft and began a search of the immediate ground area, moving left to right and back again. Even stranger, the craft never made a noise the entire time. In fear, they were searching for him and his flashlight. He turned it off, still cupped in his hand. The craft hovered around the treetops for about 4 minutes after that and then took off. Witnesses P2 and P3 are said to be brother and sister and are driving down the Klondike Highway in the same vehicle. They had left Whitehorse at about 6 p.m. and were traveling north only about 6 kilometers or 4 miles from the village. It was about 8:50 p.m. as they were just about done their 3-hour drive, when they both saw a huge row of lights moving over the hills to the north. The lights began to flash rapidly as if someone was turning the switches on and off, and then once they were all off, the craft could not be seen at all. Witness P2, the sister who was driving, made note that the strange object was the same size as the Big Dipper above it. This observation also greatly helped determine the estimated size of the craft. P3, the brother, claimed the object was bigger than any airplane he had ever seen. Around the same time P2 and P3 were driving into town, a group of young women, witnesses P4 to P7, the group had just stepped outside for a small break from an evening course they were all attending at the local college. They all had stepped out onto a 1-story deck when they saw a very strange object in the sky moving over the village to the north and then disappeared behind a hill where it ran into P2 and P3. A total of 7 witnesses came forward that night in Pali Crossing to say they had seen the strange light too. What was it? Who was it? And where was it going? Today, this Yukon UFO seen on December 11, 1996, is considered one of the most well-documented and investigated Canadian UFO cases, thanks to lead investigator, a Yukon government employee, Martin Jessic, who was able to convince the original 22 terrified witnesses out of hiding to tell their stories, and so he could investigate. He interviewed each witness for quite some time, all separately, and collected a ton of information: distances, directions, timelines, and drawings. 14 witnesses in total made drawings. Amazingly, all these drawings were pretty similar across the board. He was able to piece together a strange but consistent story about a very large object that flew about 200 miles or 321 kilometers north along Fox Lake in the central Yukon that December evening. He took into consideration things like hallucinations, military activity, and even satellites possibly re-entering. But he concluded in his final report, and I quote, "He was able to find more witnesses than the original 22, and with having over 30 people from completely different places all collaborating the same story, that the sighting of a giant UFO in the Yukon Territory on Wednesday, December 11, 1996, was most likely a product of a non-human intelligence and technology far beyond current knowledge reported by mainstream science." End quote. Travel Yukon has a great video about the whole event. You can even see the Braeburn Lodge, meet Steve the owner, and see his famous cinnamon buns. The link will be down below or at nothingcanada.com under the show notes. I highly recommend you watch it if you enjoyed this tale. It's only about 4 minutes. The craft was rumored to be spotted that evening as far north as the Golden City of Dawson. So what was an object that was so big it was described by all who seen it larger than a football stadium? And what was with the orange rectangular lights and then the bright white beam of light that seemed to be searching for other light sources possibly? Whatever it was, it woke up that stretch of highway for quite some time. Everyone had their eyes on the sky, but the craft never seemed to return as far as we know. And they never stopped at the Braeburn Lodge for those famously large cinnamon buns that the locals joked they did, unless Steve Watson, the lodge owner, is not telling us all something. I'm Canadian Girl. Until next time.
This podcast is a part of Straight Up Strange Productions. Discover more shows like this one at straightupstrange.com.
Want to help support the show? You can do that in 3 simple ways. The first one, you can leave us a shiny 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. This small gesture means so much to this podcast as it allows us to move around on the podcast charts and meet more awesome listeners like you. The second, you can stop by our souvenir shop and pick up a souvenir from one of our great adventures and take it on your very own. There's t-shirts, water bottles, notebooks, and so much more. Do head over to our souvenir shop today and grab some adventure gear. And finally, the third way you can help support the show is by donation. We have a fancy PayPal button that can be found on the top right of our webpage. This button allows you the option to donate as much as you want, whenever you want. All donations will be used for the channel by buying new books for research and upgrading equipment. All 3 links to help support the show, of course, can be found in the show notes below. I thank you all so much for your support of the show. It means the world to me.